Welcome, everyone. This is a response to a lot of listening with Jordan Peterson. His brilliance and the relevance of the material that he brings up has been so exciting. And it challenges everyone who listens to be a part of the great dialogue. Uh, Not only those dialogues which he presents to us, so brilliantly interviewing other people, but what he speaks of is at the core of a person's own in education, which is that there's an inner dialogue that goes on where one doesn't only need those on the outside, but in one's thinking process, the awareness of other views has permeated oneself so that one has a conversation going on within. This never obviates the need to continually engage with people, uh, but it's how we ourselves become changed and how even our own, what would say be the private inner life, reveals itself to be a place of relationship where we get past the isolation, which is so much the bane of this era, or really of any era in history. If we take the core reality as being one of relationship, as so many have said, as was brought up so pointedly in some of the last talks by people that Dr. Peterson was interviewing. In my own life, the people who have said that so forcefully have been two great Jewish thinkers from the early part of the 20th century, Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig. Buber, who challenged the entire Western outlook of this philosophy in I and Thou, and saying basically every act that we take expresses a relationship that we're in, be it the relationship of I, it, meaning the things to which we relate, we treat merely as being objects of utility to us, perhaps, or of danger to us, but possessing no real quality that requires us to see ourselves in them, only the satisfaction of our needs or things which would thwart the obtaining of our needs in them. That's the I-it relationship. The I-thou relationship is that in which we see the other as another just like ourselves, a thou, meaning I impart to the other the same sense we have the integrity of being inside, of a subjectivity which is irreducible. So the other is then not reducible to my needs or how they fit into the scheme for uh, attaining what I need and or want, and avoiding that which is dangerous to me and uh, what I plan. Rosenzweig is, I think, deeper in many ways, but harder to explain. Rosenzweig doesn't allow that any uh, subjectivity, however great, monopolizes the entirety of our discourse. That between the world, uh, ourselves, and God, there obtain relationships always of the world to God is, and back and forth, the God to world is the relationship of creation. Uh, God to us, to the people, is the relationship of revelation. And people to the world is the relationship of redemption. And these are the truths of their being. And philosophers have continuously tried to reduce two of the three factors and make one to be entirely self-sufficient. Rosenzweig rejects that. Uh, and although one might think that that's, how could one say that with respect to God, from whom all things come? Well, it would be in as much as We are created through God revealing God's own desire, uncaused from anything without, to be in relationship. Therefore, who are we to undo that, except in as much as we need a way to undo our own arrogation of finality and totality to our own ego or ego structures that we set up, in which case, when one contemplates that one is created out of nothing, then that is a tonic for a swelled ego, or for any sense of an ego being anything other than a snapshot, a momentary snapshot of what our I is, our own subjectivity, and its understanding to that point. So the relationships are also key to a theme that was picked up the first time that I heard it last Thursday's conversation, where the topic of Alfred North Whitehead was brought up at some length, more than the occasional passing once in a while. I've heard Dr. Peterson quote him, but the great mention that it came in from the sage of the Isle of Skye, the island where the pretender son, Bonnie Prince Charlie, took refuge in going over the sea to Skye and attempting to save the last true and remnant of the Stuart line, and all the romance and tragedy associated with that story. But the beautiful island off the coast, the west coast of Scotland. He brought up Whitehead and called him perhaps the most important philosopher of the 20th century. And I would tend to agree. I certainly like him more than just about anybody else of the people that he's heard of or acquainted with, and the broad swath of general philosophy, although I'd certainly put my vote in for someone that he probably has never read, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, whose thought is of incredible depth and power. But Whitehead, with his marvelous musings, it really brings out this power of relation, in as much as that he conceives of the world as on the beings within it in the state of prehension. To use some of those, let's go off that track. That'll take a while to explain. I don't think we'll get into it right now. I don't want to make it a Whitehead lecture, but the idea of the adventure of thinking about God that Whitehead espouses and presents to us in such a heady, marvelous way, understanding God as not being some kind of abstract absolute, but being engaged in this process in which all of creation is included within. And I was introduced to Whitehead through another 20th century philosopher, Charles Hartshorne, a great American philosopher who's very underread, in my opinion. Tremendous man, as well, a very accomplished and learned ornithologist, as well as a marvelous philosophical, theological thinker. And his beautifully written books and comments on other philosophers put forth the thinking, panentheistic thinking, and the entire idea that we don't have this either or choice of a God who is so beyond the world that we save God by making God utterly transcendent, but then we have no idea what God's relationship is to the world. So it's essentially meaningless because ascribing absolute transcendence means we could never have a relationship, or certainly one that we could understand. Uh, or on the other hand, collapsing God into being merely the sum total of the physical universe, pantheism, but proposed and said the idea of panentheism, that the entirety of the world is included within God, so that it is interior to the divine experience rather than God being outside and somehow uh, divorced from it. He read Whitehead and constantly would quote him, and I turned to Whitehead because of that, and have loved the time that I've spent. Although his language is often very poetic and takes a slow, careful reading to enjoy. Also, I think Whitehead's formulation of what he calls the prime fallacy of our generation of thought as being what he calls the fallacy of misplaced concretion, meaning that, in the simplest sense, we mistake our models for reality, for concrete reality, and therefore don't feel the need to revise our models against a reality which they always only can partially express because our attention is only capable of dealing with certain aspects of concrete reality. And what it follows from that, of course, is the priority of the concrete to the abstract and its superiority, something which is, there are some threads of that in medieval thinkers, but mostly that seems very strange to us. Have we not read Shlomo ibn Gabirol, the Fons Vitae, the Makor Chaim from the Middle Ages, or others from of a more mystical bent, whether it be Blake seeing the universe in a blade of grass or a grain of sand, or others of that ilk who realize that if we only look at the concrete world as a place that generates ideas for us, we're missing an awful lot. And any idea can't measure up to that universe that's inside each of those things. Those were wonderful things which popped up this week, which finally got me moving to make this attempt, which hopefully I'll be getting used to this medium and being able to make things increasingly more succinct, more enjoyable, more challenging, more engaging as you go along and feel this out. My main idea of that I wanted to engage with in this first laying out of this part of the great dialogue is from sources which Dr. Peterson has not brought up, probably because they're not familiar. They haven't been part of the larger Western canon, although they've had a tremendous influence on it. And I'm speaking here about the Jewish mystical tradition. The first great flowering in a systematic and exclusively mystical way would be in the literature of the Kabbala, which the more ancient parts of it are the Hechalot literature going way back and not very well known, found in Geniza fragments from 1500 years ago or even more. But then books appearing after that, as we get towards the mark of only 1,000 or so years ago, Sefer Yetzirah, the Zohar, and then books which flower in the center of mystical study in Jewish Spain in the High Middle Ages. Eventually, with the expulsion of Jews from Spain, moving to great centers in what's modern day Greece, Salonika, and then to the land of Israel in the 1500s with the Tzfat community, and then spreading all over from the base in Tzfat over all the Jewish communities, as the Tzfat Kabbalists had a huge influence there. Also, some of the Spanish exiles went to Italy, and that's where this little uh, train of my thought is chugging off towards right now, because it's there that a very fortuitous coming together took place. In the Italian community, there were several teachers who, in that Renaissance atmosphere, in the religious humanist atmosphere that was there, certainly nurtured by Neoplatonism, and that helped to make it a much more welcoming atmosphere than the Aristotelian mindset had produced before that. Although certainly in the Aristotelian Middle Ages there was real dialogue in at least in the books and the ideas between the philosophers in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and they referred to each other in their books, even though there was not a lot of not very much in the way of personal contact. But here in Renaissance Italy, we do get personal contact, and two main figures on the Christian side and two on the Jewish side. The figures I'm looking at on the Christian side are the philosopher Pico della Mirandola, and then later the priest scholar Johannes Reuchlin, both of whom well, Pico was an Italian, Reuchlin came down into Italy to study at the centers of learning, and they both made the hookups, as it were, with great rabbis, sometimes with Ovadia of Bartanura, the rabbi who was a biblical commentator, well versed in philosophy, and a somewhat Neoplatonistic, rationalistic viewpoint in his biblical commentaries, and influenced Reuchlin in his studies, helped him become a consummate Hebrew scholar and someone who's went to work in the Christian institutions of higher learning to bring out the necessity of Hebrew learning. He was also touched by Jewish mysticism, became a Christian Kabbalist, one of the earliest ones and most influential ones in that field, something which did not go to the mainstream, I think largely because of the effects of the Reformation and exciting the terrible reaction, the Counter-Reformation, and the church retreating from the genial intellectual climb of the Neoplatonistic Renaissance into a much stricter, harsher atmosphere that did not welcome such things, rather wanted to define the one true and only way. Pico, who died altogether too young, was influenced both by learning Hebrew sources, biblical and rabbinic, but then he had a study with Rav Yaakov Alamano, a German Kabbalist, and Pico was entranced with it. He doesn't go quite the same way as Ficino goes, his colleague at that time, who goes into magical things of other traditions. But he sees in the Kabbalah this bridging of the barrier to relationship between this material world and divinity that was so much there as a result of the thoroughly transcendent and only transcendent viewpoint of how God should be understood that so dominated the Aristotelian high Middle Ages, and leaving us always to wonder what kind of relationship actually was there, if anything ever could be said meaningful about it, and really making perhaps the whole idea of a relationship with something utterly transcendent as being simply a contradiction in terms and utterly impossible by definition. In the Kabbalah, there is no such barrier. There is no problem in dealing with the immanence of God. That's in general theological terms. My main point here is not so much for that, although there's a great interest, and we come back to that, but um, looking at psychology, being of particular interest in Dr. Peterson's talks, and with uh, some who he was talking with, particularly this last week, with extensive talk about right brain and left brain functions. The idea of left brain being the seat of an analytical way of looking at the world as something to be parsed, as a world which is only an it, a world which can be understood best through abstractions, mathematics, uh, 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 and algorithms, viewed in a utilitarian way, but not susceptible to um, meaning in the largest sense, other than through a utility which we take for granted without examining it. In other words, why do we need that? What is the value of that utility? Is it something that is worth serving? Something can be very useful for an aim which is very bad, and the algorithms don't seem to give us a way to differentiate between the goal of the utility that we uncover in picking the world to pieces and finding uh, relevances that fit in that narrow focused spotlight of this kind of left brain attention. So we can come and pick the atom apart and unleash tremendous forces, which perhaps can be used for the good, and certainly they have been, and perhaps can be used for purposes which would be quite the opposite of the good, and so on and so forth. It provides little more than a professed indifference to the aims. Right brain, on the other hand, is the source of apprehensions of wholeness, of a reality which is irreducible, which always contextualizes any kind of formulation we can make with our mind, any kind of bright focus. This always reminds us that it's within the context of something which edges off into the unknown, and anything that we do know is only partial, and has to be. It enforces a humility based on truth on the left side of our brain, whereas the left side work with respect to the right is to coax it and to allow us to forward such good purposes as we have, and if we can get the moral clearance from the right and the left working together. That's something which needs some work on that thought there. But I'd like to speak about how those ideas manifested in Kabbalistic psychology, because I think that could add a great deal to the conversation. In the earlier works of Kabbalah, we find, going from Sefer Yetzirah onwards, we have the development of in a very forthright way, of the Sephirotic system of 10 spheros, or we could call them manifestations perhaps, really meant to show between them what comes about as the all one manifests itself in a plural universe, in all the ways. So in the earliest Kabbalah, the Sephirot are 10 different ways that godliness is manifest. So let's take one reading of them that start with the highest Sephira would be Chokhmah, wisdom, then Bina, understanding, Da'as, knowledge, and all those words have distinct meanings, which I'll bring out later. And then through things which you might call emotional qualities of kindness on the one side, inner power on the other side, beauty / compassion, interestingly associated with each other. Another slash would put truth in there, all those three things. a single sephira placed in the middle between kindness on the right and power within on the left. And so on and so forth, to the last of the Sfirot being that of Malchut, which means sovereignty or kingship, which means how all the other things above it are received and become unified within an outward action. So all of those are seen and developed originally as being applying strictly to God, and as the culture works forward, and we come to the Hasidic movement in the 1700s. You have really beginning, at least in the oral basis for it was set out by the teachings of Rabbi Yisrael ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, but the systematic teachings really start in a written way with the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, was the leader of the Hasidic movement, a man whom Carl Jung spoke of with admiration and awe, Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, the Mezricher Magid, or the preacher of Mezrich, and then his successors are most familiar with the most systematic organization of this thinking in the Hasidic movement, which is through the Chabad tradition, started in the late 1700s by Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi and carried on up to our time, continuing to be well studied within the religious Jewish world, and increasingly now in toeholds in the academic world, speaking done brilliantly by such people as Elliot Wolfson, now in UC Santa Barbara, and others. But I'd like to concentrate on the main thrust of what happens in the Hasidic writings, where these manifestations of how the oneness of God manifests in the plurality of the universe are taken by this great leap in the Hasidic thinkers to also be evident within the human soul, working back from Genesis 1 with the image of God being present in humanity, and it being in the soul. So if we pay attention to the soul, we'll see the same kind of pattern. And now, how interesting that this first pattern. Let me go to what I was saying. I gave words which could be fairly meaningless. We might think of them all as identical synonyms: wisdom, understanding, knowledge. But they're very specifically delineated in this tradition as having certain different qualities of the mind, of the intellect. And interestingly, they're placed on lines along with the other 10, the others of the 10 sefirot, right, left, and center. So Chochmah, the highest of them, wisdom, is placed on the right side. Bina, understanding, is placed on the left. And what's the difference between them? Well, Chochmah is the panoptic vision, emerging from nothingness. We have an inchoate light in the soul, but it's not formed into anything particular. No differentiation at all. And its first move to be a differentiated consciousness, a specific consciousness, is with a sense of a specific whole. There is a grasp of a whole of things, a vision of everything at once. It's called the point within the palace, or the dot, or the smallest of the letters. It's the verse translated with some liberty, or a phrase from the Bible is used to define it. Chochma me'ayin timotze. In this reading, that means wisdom comes to be out of nothing. It emerges where there was no identifiable thought. There is a thought, but the first thought is of a wholeness in which all things are seen at once. But it has a particular power that it drives one then from that right side vision of all at once to the left side vision of Bina, which is basically, instead of a vision of things, it is a telling of things. It is a sequential rendering of what has to be seen all at once in the panoptic vision of the right side of Chokhmah. It's our ability to break things apart, to analyze them, to see sequences in them, to see causes and effect, to see even mechanical causation, the way that certain things and certain processes can be reduced to formulae. Interestingly, that the Kabbalists see as sitting on the left side. And then finally, there is the quality of da'as, knowledge. And what they mean by knowledge is this. Both chokhmah and bina, right side, left side, could crank on and on in their isolation and go around and around and around and never engage the outside world, or even the inner world outside the brain. In other words, not be emotionally engaging. Dat is the point where that which the mind has grasped, that which the intellect has been working with, is now perceived not only as intellectually real, but existentially moving. To affirm what is known through Das is necessary. To deny anything which denies what is known, the truth of what Das reveals, one must fight that. The emotions will become perturbed at the denial of the truth, and the emotions will be uplifted when that truth is affirmed. It's no longer just merely an intellectual process. We could see that probably in the first biblical use of das, maybe not as das as a noun, but das as a from that root in knowing. Where do we find the first knowing in Scripture? It's in just a little bit down the Genesis story, and Adam knew Eve, his wife. So we're not talking about a merely abstract kind of knowledge. We're talking about one that's existentially engaging, one in which one's emotions are entirely present together with the knowing. The knowing and the heart are together there. Without knowledge, there wouldn't be any feeling, and without the feeling, there wouldn't be das. You wouldn't be engaged with the other person in what you're doing in any way that would be worthy of it, without that full mind heart integration. And that is das, and that then acts as the bridge between the mind and the heart, in which the brain and the heart do not go their separate ways. A person then having this walking around as a unintegrated or even a shattered self. That's brought about through this quality of das. The remedy to that is brought about through it. So it seems to me there's a great deal that can be brought out by exploring the insights of the literature and going forward on that into the greater conversation we have. Just as in the Renaissance, there was a tremendous opening that took place through that strain that we were speaking about with Johannes Reuchlin and with Pico della Mirandola. How so? Because those names might not be familiar to many. Pico, in his brief but brilliant philosophical career, wrote something called Oration on the Dignity of Man, which was a it affected deeply the mindset of the world. What it proposed was that it was a full humanism, that God had bestowed wondrous powers on the human being who has this innate dignity because of that, and the contentment of the medieval world to let the image of God be manifest only in just the spirit of all these people who are oppressed, but never reflected in their political systems, is suddenly shown as being only one among many theories, and perhaps a very inadequate one. So Jefferson, among others, refers to this as being a crucial piece in the awakening up of people for the necessity to have a political system which reflects this idea of human dignity, which is implicit from the beginning in the idea of the image of God being who the human being is, the core of the human identity being that, and that we need to build politics which recognizes that forthrightly and consciously. Uh, it moves with Reuchlin in a somewhat similar way, certainly in his pushing of study of Hebrew texts as part of the Christian curriculum, which he thought was necessary and would properly ground Christianity, rather than allow the worst of the distortions of it to come out, as it happened so often in the Middle Ages, of the horrible history of expulsions and persecutions, with such horrifically quasi-religious things, getting often the full sanction of the church, and an odd mythos that developed in the culture that it generated, of such things as the blood libel, which started in England and spread all over and hasn't ceased since. That how many Jews lost their lives is uncountable, to this bizarre charge that Jews would seek a Christian child's blood in order to make their matzah for Passover. It said it's even surfaced in the 20th century with a Muslim so-called sage and Saudi Arabia putting forth the charge that this is done in order to make the Purim pastries that Jews eat on Purim, or to such things as the profanation of the host. The charge went out quite often during the Middle Ages that Jews would go into churches and steal the communion wafers in order that they should be able to take it and stab it and kill the Christian Savior again. Of course, imputing to Jews that they believed in transubstantiation, but of course, these people were not trained philosophers, so the irony of it didn't appear, and it didn't seem very ironic to the people who were tortured and put to death over that. Reuchlin was a true humanist, and in his deep acquaintance that came through his study with the rabbis, with the Hebrew sources, and with Jewish life, actual Jewish life, and practitioners on a high level, he became a force in the other direction, interceding with the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian when he was about to confiscate and have burned the Talmuds of the Jews living in the Holy Roman Empire. He interceded before the emperor to get him to negate that terrible decree, which would have, in the age where most books had to be still copied by hand, or even if they were printed, it's still not become as inexpensive as those things are now. It would have been a terrible blow and a terrible setback. And of course, the idea of burning another religion's holy literature, the infamy of that on its own, was something that Reuchlin was able to get across. And in his idea of having humanism embedded in the religious study in Europe, which he and others succeeded to get in. The others who had not as much interest in Hebrew learning as he did, but it became part of that humanist program that was going to carry over with the emergence of Protestant thinkers as the Protestant movement matured towards the end of the 16th century. And there we're going to have a tremendous carryover with one of the main branches of that religious thinking in the 17th century, then the 1600s, goes, as is shown so brilliantly by Professor Eric Nelson in this book, The Hebrew Republic, on having a profound influence in the beginnings of democracy, and the writers in that century who make the move towards Western political conceptions taking hold. Hugo Grotius in Holland, being very familiar with rabbinic law and using a concept there of the 7 Noahide laws as really underlying his conception of international law, which really set the stage for Europe, and with the breakdown of the Christian unity. And the choice seemed to be at his time either endless war to establish the correct, proper vision for all to have by being either the church triumphant or the Protestantism triumphant, and they beat each other to a bloody stalemate. And Grotius, backed by this idea that as seen by the Jewish sages and hinted at and structured into the text of Genesis, is that the specific, well-developed rituals and religious laws that applied to the community of Israel did not apply to everyone in the world, not because everyone in the world is not saved and doomed, and they're doomed because of being outside the one true religion, but so a bit of a break. I'll pick up the thread. Another area where it went was through the extraordinary scholarship of John Selden of England, who was inspired by Grotius in his work in law, but his work centered first in English common law. He was one of the great common lawyers, a seminal figure in the development of British democracy. He was one of the leaders of the movement that got the Petition of Right through Parliament to challenge the king, basically a restatement of the Magna Carta, asserting the privileges of Parliament and it's both Lords and Commons against the king, and of liberties of the individual person, one of the great landmarks in the development of political liberty. Selden was not only an author of it, but he piloted it, helped to pilot it through Commons. He had been himself imprisoned by King James for writing something that the king didn't like to hear, that was based on the beginnings of some of Selden's Hebraic scholarship. Now, in the wake of the Petition of Right, when King Charles set himself hard against Parliament and tried to renege on the promises that he had made, in the aftermath of the blow-up that happened, Charles had Selden imprisoned in the Tower of London, and Selden was held there for some time. The conditions were relaxed a bit so that he could bring books into his imprisonment. And the book he asked for was the Talmud, and he became a self-taught Talmudist. There's a considerable scope to his learning, and his virtuosity was really amazing, being that he did not study with anyone, and taught himself the linguistic skills and deciphered the methods of Talmud, which are quite different than anything found in any other literature, perhaps with the exception in some way of Islamic law, where some of the same kind of rules are sometimes followed. But this, of course, precedes Islamic law. And Talmud is not just a book of law, but rather the discussion of law and debate, and really meant to preserve an oral tradition that was under such pressure that people feared that if it were left entirely oral, it would disappear, wouldn't make it. So a kind of encoded document to be at the same time written and oral. And somehow Selden found his way through it and acquired quite a homegrown mastery. And his scholarship turns entirely to, or almost entirely to, his Hebrew projects, mostly in rabbinic law, which occupy him for much of the next part of his life, even as he goes about trying to be an influence for constitutionalism, neither the unbridled parliament nor the unbridled king, nor any of the various church groups which were asserting their primacy. He fought to have minimal assertions of divine law, following Grotius and the rabbis in saying what was given to the world in terms of divine law is only a choice few things, the 7 Noahide commandments. But among those commandments are the one commanding all the peoples of the world to set up systems of justice that can make law and adjudicate law according to that which works in their place and time, nobody being compelled to follow the particulars of the experience of Israel, but rather the gist of it. And Selden took to that and understood it very deeply, applied it. One of the most notable times is he was involved in the conference at Westminster, when the Presbyterian group was trying to establish itself as the established church of England, to take out what nowadays in America you call the Episcopal Church. In other words, the whole structure with bishops over the church, the episcopate, which the Presbyterians denied. It was the presbytery that they looked and they said, they made the claim, this is divine law, the presbyteries should be that which determine everything about the church. The old Church of England people say, no, it's divine law, that we have the chain of descent expressed through, back from the beginning of the first bishop of Rome all the way through all the bishops. Now, of course, they were Protestant because Henry VIII, but that meant simply that they didn't owe first allegiance to Rome, but the structure of the bishopric, having the various bishoprics that they wanted to commune, and they say it's divine law, and Selden intervenes. He didn't have to do much because the Presbyterians had by far the upper hand, not the Episcopalian party. But he said to both of them, basically, neither of you have divine law per se, saying it intervenes decisively and in a way that you cannot debate in this. No, it is a matter of debate. This is part of the area that's been given to each nation to determine on its own, in its own structure of courts and laws, to determine what works for the proper religious setup. That is divine law, and not the other. So this reading of divine law, as the rabbis did, which really advanced the idea of no religious group gets to dictate to the country what must be followed because it has a superior law. The realm of the 7 Noahide laws are basically against murder, against theft and kidnapping. There's a code of sexual morality. There is a prohibition against basically cruelty to animals. Basic things. And the court system being set up is something that would tend to the organized societal hand promoting justice within that rough skeleton, and then with due respect to what motivates each group. So in light of that, Selden saw the whole idea of English common law as being just another branch of the great stream that ran through Jewish oral law. And how so? What's the main thing? It is law which respects the direct relationship between God and the individual person, the image of God in the individual person, and that the law itself is born by the people in their hearts, and it is largely oral, contextual, and it is its authority, since it is coming from God, is based on people's love of God and affection, therefore, for God's order in the world. And so thus we have an English common law, which up until recently didn't even have a statute for murder in England. Um, so let this suffice then for an opening contribution. And it we touch many themes that have been there in many of the latest talks, and some of them stretching back for a while. Um, and every person who joins the conversation broadens it. There are things which we're each given to see, which is part of our mission in the world of testifying to that truth. There'll be enough commonality with others to be able to make the case and share it, and others will do the same. We're continually enriching each other and continuing to express a more and more profound idea of a oneness which is strengthened by unity rather than threatened by it. Of course, that is common to the totalitarian, the paranoia, the sense that everything threatens what looks on the outside to be a rock hard oneness of one people, one Führer. In the end, is utterly splintered within, because there's no trust there at all of anyone. The people at the core of such systems, whether it's a Hitler or a Stalin or a Mao, constantly are setting others against each other, and sitting on top of a system of a brutal system that destroys people, and hopefully the leader hopes preserves their own power and their own life. Our own way towards free living in the West, towards understanding and realizing that model of taking seriously that image of God in each person, on the other hand, is built on an ever-growing trust, and wisdom is used to be able to discern dangers for that and to appropriately deal with them without risking the continual build of trust, without setting that cause back. So may the conversation continue.